It was a typical morning when David woke up to the sound of his alarm buzzing relentlessly. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, casting a soft orange glow over the horizon, but David had been up for a while. He had always been a man of routine, early to bed, early to rise. He stretched and rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep as he glanced over at his wife, Lily, still fast asleep beside him. A smile tugged at the corner of his lips. She had always been his anchor, even after all these years of long hours on the road. They'd been married for over 15 years, and though she hated the fact that he spent so much time driving across the country, she understood the need. The bills didn't pay themselves. David gently slid out of bed, careful not to wake her, and walked into the kitchen to start his morning routine. The smell of coffee was the first thing that hit him as he brewed the pot, savoring the anticipation of the first sip. He glanced at the clock, noting that it was already later than he'd planned. He had to leave soon if he was going to make his usual route through the highway. It was going to be a long day, but that was nothing new. After all, he had been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, and the rhythm of the road had become second nature. He lived for it, the hum of the engine, the open road stretching endlessly in front of him, the feeling of freedom that only a trucker could understand. Lily woke up as David was packing his lunch, offering a sleepy smile as she slid out of bed and walked over to him. She was used to this routine by now, but it didn't make it any easier. She hated the waiting, the worry, the days that seemed to stretch endlessly without him by her side. Still, she didn't say much, knowing that David loved his job, that it paid the bills, and allowed them to live comfortably. "Have a safe trip," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. David kissed her forehead, telling her he'd be back in time for dinner. He quickly grabbed his jacket and keys, heading out the door to the garage. His truck, an old but reliable Freightliner, was parked in its usual spot. David had spent hours maintaining it, making sure it was in peak condition for the long hours ahead. He had driven all sorts of rigs over the years, but this one was his favorite. It had character, scratches and dents from countless miles traveled, a worn-out interior that felt more like home than any place he'd ever lived. He climbed into the cab, adjusting his seat, flicking on the ignition, and listening to the engine come to life with a deep rumble. The road was calling. The radio played softly in the background as David pulled out of the driveway, heading toward the highway. It was a quiet morning, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. The steady rhythm of the tires on the road and the hum of the engine created a sense of calm, a familiarity he could never get tired of. As he passed through the sleepy town, his eyes wandered to the familiar buildings, the gas station he stopped at, the diner where he grabbed coffee on occasion, the old post office where he dropped off packages over the years. These places had all become part of his routine, part of the fabric of his life. The highway stretched out in front of him, a seemingly endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the countryside. David felt at home here. This was his world. He passed other trucks along the way, each one a fellow traveler with their own story. He waved at the drivers as he passed, a silent acknowledgement of the shared bond they had, the road. He'd known many of them for years, some of them had even become friends over time, and it wasn't unusual to have a quick chat on the CB radio, swapping stories about the road or just checking in. Today, however, the road felt quieter than usual. Maybe it was the early hour, or perhaps it was just the calm before the storm. As he made his way toward the exit that would take him onto the main stretch of highway, David couldn't help but notice how empty it seemed. Traffic was light, and the usual bustle of morning commuters was nowhere to be seen. He shook his head, wondering if maybe it was just too early for people to be out. It didn't matter much to him. He liked the solitude of the road. It allowed him to think, to clear his mind. But as he drove on, something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. The wind had picked up slightly, the sky darkening in the distance. He checked the weather on his phone. It wasn't supposed to rain, but the clouds were heavy, and the wind howled ominously. Still, there was no turning back. He had a schedule to keep, and the freight he was carrying had to reach its destination on time. As David neared a bend in the highway, the first signs of trouble started to emerge. He could see the flashing lights in the distance, police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks all lined up on the shoulder of the road. His stomach dropped. There had been an accident. A big one, by the looks of it. He couldn't make out the details, but the scene was chaotic. He slowed down, instinctively, his eyes scanning the road ahead for any sign of danger. The flashing lights reflected off the wet pavement, creating a strobe effect that made it hard to see clearly. David's heart skipped a beat when he noticed the wreckage up ahead. Several vehicles were smashed together, and the scene was a mess. There was a car upside down in the ditch, its windshield shattered, and two other vehicles collided in a crumpled heap in the middle of the road. A small crowd had gathered on the side of the highway, and emergency responders were moving quickly, but David could tell that things weren't under control. The highway was blocked, and the traffic had nowhere to go. Panic began to set in. David pulled his truck over to the shoulder, carefully avoiding the wreckage as best he could. He put on his hazard lights and jumped out of the cab, moving toward the scene of the accident. His instincts as a truck driver kicked in. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew that the first moments after an accident were crucial. He had to do something. But what? As he approached the wreckage, he could see people were already trying to help, pulling at the debris to reach the victims inside the cars. A small group of pedestrians was trying to guide traffic away from the accident site, but the cars coming in behind them were driving too fast. They were too close to the wreckage, and it was only a matter of time before another crash happened. David's pulse quickened. He had to make a decision. He looked around at the other truckers who had started to arrive, some of them slowing down to see what was happening. He had always been the type to help where he could, but this situation was different. The chaos was overwhelming. The road was clogged, the danger was growing, and time was running out. There wasn't much he could do to save the people in the cars, but one thing was for sure: if something wasn't done soon, more people would get hurt. He reached for his phone and called Mike, one of his fellow truck drivers, knowing that if anyone could help, it would be Mike. "Mike, you there?" David's voice was sharp with urgency. "Yeah, David. What's going on?" Mike asked, his voice low but concerned. "There's an accident up ahead, bad one. We need to block off the highway before more cars come flying in. We've got to stop this." There was a long pause on the line before Mike responded. "I'm on it. I'll get the others." David felt a sense of relief as he hung up, but it was short-lived. He turned to the others who were gathering around, and as they nodded in understanding, he knew what had to be done. The highway needed to be shut down. And that was exactly what he was going to do. David stood at the edge of the highway, the rumbling sound of nearby engines filling the air. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the urgency of the situation settling in. This wasn't just another roadblock, this was a matter of life or death. He knew that the longer they waited, the higher the risk of more accidents. And the people who were already involved in the crash, he couldn't even begin to imagine how badly they were injured. He had to act, and quickly. As he looked around, he saw more trucks pulling off the highway. A few familiar faces among them, Mike, Carl, and some of the others he had known for years. They were all experienced drivers, veterans of the road who knew exactly how to handle tough situations. But this was different. David's mind raced as he gestured for the other drivers to follow him. "We've got to block the road completely," he called out, his voice firm but urgent. "No one gets through until we've got this under control." Mike, a burly man with a thick beard and a no-nonsense attitude, nodded immediately. "I'm with you," he said, already starting to back his rig into position. The others followed suit, positioning their trucks across the highway in a series of tight formations, forming a barrier that would prevent any vehicles from getting too close. It wasn't just about stopping traffic, it was about creating a safe zone. They needed to control the situation, and the more drivers they had involved, the better. As David watched the trucks line up, he felt a sense of pride, but it was quickly overshadowed by the urgency of the moment. There was no time to waste. He motioned for the others to stay alert. "We need to keep the road clear for emergency vehicles. I'm going to check on the people in the wreck. See if anyone needs help," he said, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. Mike gave him a quick nod. "We'll hold the line. You do what you need to do." David's boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way toward the scene of the crash. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and spilled fuel, and the wreckage before him was a twisted mess of metal and shattered glass. He could see a couple of paramedics already tending to one of the drivers, a middle-aged woman, who was being carefully pulled from her vehicle. Her face was pale, and it was clear that she was in a lot of pain, but at least she was alive. David's heart skipped a beat when he saw the other car, a pickup truck that had collided with the woman's sedan. The driver of the pickup was slumped over the wheel, unmoving. It didn't look good. "Hey, is she okay?" David asked one of the paramedics as he approached. His voice was steady, though his mind was racing with questions. The paramedic, a woman in her 30s, glanced up at him with a weary look. "She's hurt, but she's stable. We're doing what we can." That truck driver, she shook her head, her face grim. "He's not responding. We're going to have to pull him out, but we need to be careful. Could be a head injury." David nodded, his stomach turning. He had seen plenty of accidents in his years as a trucker, but this one was different. The scale of the crash, the chaos, it was overwhelming. His instincts told him that if they didn't get more help soon, this situation was going to spiral out of control. He turned his attention to the other vehicles involved. There were 2 others, both small sedans, but they didn't appear to be as badly damaged. He could see the drivers of both cars standing outside, dazed but seemingly unharmed. The wreckage from the crash had scattered across the highway, and debris was strewn all over the place. It was going to take hours to clear, and that was assuming no one else got hurt in the process. Just as David was about to approach the emergency responders, a new sound caught his attention, the screech of tires, followed by the honking of horns. A car was coming fast, and it didn't look like it was slowing down. "Hey! Stop!" David shouted, but it was too late. The car veered dangerously close to the wreckage, swerving to avoid hitting the wrecked vehicles but ending up driving right into the middle of the debris field. The driver was clearly panicked, his eyes wide with fear as he swerved from side to side, desperately trying to avoid hitting anything. David's heart stopped. This was exactly what they had feared. If that car hit one of the wrecked vehicles, it would cause even more damage. Without thinking, David sprinted toward the car, waving his arms to try and get the driver's attention. The car skidded to a halt just inches from one of the overturned vehicles, the tires screeching as the driver slammed on the brakes. The man inside was shaking, his hands gripping the wheel with white knuckles. "Are you okay?" David asked, his voice shaking with adrenaline as he approached the car. The driver looked up at him, wide-eyed, but didn't answer. "You can't drive through here." David continued, his voice more forceful now. "This is a dangerous zone. You need to stay back." The driver nodded quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I didn't know. I thought there was another way around." "There's no way around," David said firmly, motioning for the man to stay put. "Stay here until the emergency vehicles clear the road. Trust me, you don't want to get involved in this." The driver hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Okay. I'll wait." David gave him a quick look of reassurance before returning to the scene. The incident had been a close call, but it was a reminder of just how dangerous the situation was. As he made his way back toward the trucks, he saw more drivers pulling off the highway, joining the blockade. There were now at least 10 trucks parked across the road, blocking all incoming traffic. The emergency vehicles had finally managed to make their way through the jam, but it wasn't enough. They needed more help. And fast. David grabbed his phone and called Mike again. "We need to start getting people out of here. We've got to move some of the cars. The more vehicles we can clear, the faster we can get the wreckage off the road." Mike's voice crackled through the phone. "Got it, David. We'll start moving things around, but we'll need more hands. There's too much debris to clear with just a few of us." David agreed. He had seen enough to know that the wreckage wasn't going anywhere without a massive effort. But the question was, who would step up? They were already making a huge sacrifice by blocking the highway, but now it was time to go beyond that. They were going to have to get their hands dirty. The trucks formed an even tighter barrier as more vehicles tried to get through, only to be turned away. The road was impassable, and the once quiet morning had turned into a chaotic scene. It was a strange feeling, standing there in the middle of it all, part of something bigger than just a few individuals trying to get by. David had been a truck driver for so long that he had seen his share of accidents, but this was different. This was an entire community of people, from the drivers to the paramedics to the police officers, coming together to stop the madness, to prevent more people from getting hurt. There was a sense of unity here, something that was usually absent on the open road. As the hours passed, the scene started to take shape. The wreckage was cleared, the emergency vehicles had done their job, and people were starting to get back into their cars, albeit cautiously. The trucks slowly pulled back, allowing traffic to flow again, but the air was still thick with the remnants of the chaos. David stood at the side of the road, watching as the final few vehicles made their way through the mess. He knew the situation had been handled as best as it could be, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had happened here. "Good job," Mike said, patting David on the back as he walked past. "You did it. We did it." David nodded, his exhaustion starting to catch up with him. He could see the scene from a new perspective now. What started as a chaotic, life-threatening situation had turned into something much more meaningful. It wasn't just about stopping traffic, it was about saving lives. It was about community. And that sense of togetherness, the unspoken bond between people who didn't know each other but had come together for a common cause, was something David would never forget. As he climbed back into his truck, the weight of the day hit him like a ton of bricks. It had been a long, hard day, but it had also been a reminder of something far greater. He looked at the road ahead, his thoughts drifting back to Lily and how he couldn't wait to get home. But as he started the engine and pulled away from the scene, one question lingered in his mind: what if he hadn't acted in time? What if the others hadn't stepped up? How many lives would have been lost? And that was the question David would carry with him as he drove home. David had no sooner pulled out of the chaotic scene, the sound of his truck's engine now a dull hum in the background, when his phone buzzed. The text message caught his attention instantly, not because it was an unfamiliar number, but because of the short, direct nature of the message. "We need to talk. It's about the blockade." The message was from Mike, and David's gut instinct told him this was far from over. The ordeal with the highway crash had only just ended, but something told him there were deeper ripples to the event that hadn't yet been felt. He didn't hesitate, he immediately dialed Mike's number. "David," Mike's voice crackled through the speaker. "You okay?" "Yeah, just about to head back to the yard," David replied, his voice hoarse from hours of shouting instructions and coordinating the trucks. "What's up?" "We need to meet in person," Mike continued. "This thing isn't over. I got a call from the local news. They've got wind of what happened, and they want to cover it." David's thoughts went into overdrive. He didn't want the media involved. This wasn't about the trucks or their personal involvement, it was about the people, the lives they had potentially saved, the ones they'd managed to prevent from spiraling into another accident. I don't want the spotlight on us, Mike. This isn't about us, it's about the people in those wrecked cars. I get it, man, Mike said, but David could hear the urgency in his voice. But this thing's bigger than just a good deed on the side of the road. The community's talking. The drivers are talking. The cops are talking. The whole town knows what happened. This could get out of hand, and if we don't take control of the story, someone else will. David leaned back in his seat, eyes on the road, but his mind was spinning. He hadn't expected this. What had started as a simple act of protection and survival had turned into something much more. What if this story became sensationalized? What if it wasn't about the good they had done but the fact that they had blocked a major highway in a way that could have caused more accidents? Or worse, what if people began questioning their actions, accusing them of going too far, of stepping into a situation that had been the responsibility of the police and paramedics? All right, David finally muttered. Where do you want to meet? There's a diner on the north side of town, Mike replied. It's quiet, but not too far from the highway. I'll be there in an hour. David ended the call, but the lingering feeling of unease stayed with him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, almost as if expecting to see flashing lights behind him, an indication that they were all in trouble for what they'd done. But the road was empty, the night sky stretching out endlessly above. He took a deep breath and focused on the drive. No matter how much his mind tried to fight it, one thing was clear, he couldn't avoid the fallout forever. It took him nearly an hour to reach the diner. When he pulled into the parking lot, he spotted Mike's familiar truck already parked out front, its engine still running. Mike was sitting in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, staring out into the night. David parked beside him and climbed out of his own truck, making his way over to the window. You ready? Mike asked, rolling it down slightly. I'm ready, David replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He could feel his stomach churn, the weight of the situation starting to settle on him. The two men walked into the diner together, the faint smell of coffee and grease in the air. It was quiet for a Tuesday night, just a few locals scattered around, some in booths, others sitting at the counter. David couldn't help but notice the way people looked up as they entered. There was something different about the way they looked at him now, something that hadn't been there just hours before. Maybe it was the exhaustion on their faces, the way they held themselves, or maybe it was just that word had spread faster than they could have anticipated. They took a booth in the back, away from prying eyes, and slid into the vinyl seats. Before either of them could speak, the waitress arrived with 2 cups of coffee, setting them down with a small, tight-lipped smile. It was clear she knew something had happened, but she wasn't about to ask. The town had a way of spreading gossip, but it also had a way of letting people keep their privacy. That's what made it so special, and yet, on nights like this, it felt more like a burden. Mike took a sip of his coffee, his expression serious. The thing is, David, he began, we didn't just block the highway. We stopped people from getting to their destinations, and that's going to come back to bite us. We might have saved lives, but we also disrupted the flow of traffic, and now the town's divided on it. David listened intently, his hands wrapped tightly around the cup. He hadn't thought about it that way. They had been focused on one goal, getting people to safety, but there were consequences to their actions. They had forced people to stop, to wait, to reconsider their own travel plans. They had effectively created a bottleneck in the middle of what would have otherwise been an ordinary day. People weren't going to see it as heroism. They were going to see it as an inconvenience. That's the thing, Mike continued. Some people are calling it a heroic act. Others? They're pissed. They've been stuck in traffic for hours, some have missed meetings, others their flights. The town is split, and it's only going to get worse when the news starts running the story. David's stomach twisted. He had hoped the media would ignore it, but Mike's words were starting to feel like an inevitable truth. He couldn't ignore the fact that they had caused a ripple effect. The highway was a major artery for people in and out of the town, and by blocking it, they had stopped commerce, halted business, and upset the balance of everyday life. No one had died, thank God, but they had been part of a monumental disruption. People would talk about this for years to come. They were already talking. "I know," David said quietly. "But what else could we have done? We couldn't let that crash turn into something worse." Mike nodded but didn't say anything for a long moment. He wasn't disagreeing with David, he just knew that the situation was bigger than either of them had initially understood. And as the conversation stretched on, David began to feel the weight of it too. The town wouldn't just remember what had happened, they would remember the consequences. The uproar. The tension. They would remember the drivers who were upset, the people who had been forced to wait. "We'll see what happens when the news hits," Mike said finally, breaking the silence. "But here's the thing. People don't just talk about these things, they act on them. If enough of them push back, if they get angry enough, the authorities might come after us. And that's where we need to be ready." David's jaw tightened. He had no intention of backing down, but the thought of facing some sort of punishment weighed heavily on him. It wasn't that he was afraid of consequences, it was the idea that everything they had done, everything they had worked for in that moment, might be twisted into something ugly. He wasn't sure how to prepare for that. Mike was staring at him, waiting for a response, and David took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. "We did what we had to do. If they don't understand that, then that's on them. I'm not going to apologize for saving lives." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the finality of the statement. The conversation had come full circle, but the true challenge was just beginning. The fallout was inevitable, and it was only a matter of time before they'd have to face the consequences of their actions. Whether or not it was worth it, the town was about to find out. And no matter how hard they tried to control the narrative, David knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But the one thing he was certain of was that, for better or for worse, the decision they had made that day had changed everything. As David walked back to his truck after the meeting with Mike, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The night had deepened around him, casting long shadows across the parking lot. It had been hours since they had blocked the highway, yet it felt like time had stopped, the consequences of their actions still hanging in the air, waiting to be unleashed. The calmness of the night only made the tension more palpable. He climbed into his truck, the engine humming to life beneath him, but his thoughts were 1,000 miles away. The next morning, David woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly on the bedside table. He groggily reached for it, squinting as the bright screen flashed with messages and notifications. A quick glance told him everything he needed to know. The story had already gone viral. The local news outlets had picked it up, and it was spreading faster than he could have anticipated. His heart sank. It was no longer just a small-town incident. It was now a story that the entire region was talking about. He quickly scrolled through the messages, some of them from friends, others from people he barely knew. They ranged from congratulatory to angry, each with their own opinion on what had happened. Some praised the truck drivers for their bravery, claiming that they had prevented what could have been a much worse disaster. Others criticized them, questioning why they had taken matters into their own hands, accusing them of creating chaos in a situation that should have been handled by professionals. There was even a petition circulating online demanding an investigation into the actions of the truck drivers that day. David rubbed his face, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. He wasn't sure how to respond to any of it. He hadn't expected to become the center of attention. He had just acted, driven by instinct and the urgency of the moment, but now it felt as if they were all trapped in the aftermath of their decision. His mind raced as he thought about what to do next. Should they speak to the media? Should they apologize? He had no idea, but he knew that avoiding the situation was no longer an option. He threw on some clothes and grabbed his keys, heading out the door and into his truck. The air outside was brisk, the sunlight barely peeking over the horizon as he pulled onto the empty streets of his small town. It felt different this morning, quieter somehow. Maybe it was the weight of the story, or maybe it was the eyes of the community, now aware of what had happened. As he drove, he could already see signs of the town's division. On one side of the street, people were standing in front of their houses, talking in low voices, their expressions serious. On the other side, there were groups of people shaking their heads, gesturing animatedly, clearly discussing the events that had unfolded the day before. David made his way to the local diner, the one place where the town seemed to come together. It was a small building, tucked away on a corner, with old wooden booths and checkered floors. It had always been the heart of the town, a place where people gathered to gossip, share news, and unwind. But today, the diner felt different. As he stepped inside, the chatter fell silent. Everyone turned to look at him, their gazes sharp, curious, some even judgmental. David felt the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions lingering in the air. He hesitated for a moment before taking a seat at the counter, the usual warmth of the place now replaced with an uncomfortable chill. The waitress, a woman in her mid-40s with a tired smile, approached him slowly. She had been working at the diner for as long as David could remember, and despite the town's gossip and drama, she had always been a calming presence. Today, however, her eyes were full of concern. "I heard what happened yesterday," she said quietly as she placed a cup of coffee in front of him. "You all right?" David nodded, trying to muster a reassuring smile. "Yeah. I'm fine." "Doesn't seem like it," she replied, her voice tinged with sympathy. "You're the talk of the town, you know that, right?" "I figured," David said, staring into his coffee. The dark liquid swirled, the steam rising in delicate spirals. He didn't know how to respond. What could he say? He wasn't a hero. He hadn't planned anything. He had just done what he thought was right in the moment. But the town didn't see it that way. They saw a man who had taken matters into his own hands and disrupted the normal course of life. "I've seen a lot of things in my day, David," she continued, her voice softer now, as if trying to make him feel less isolated. "But I don't know if I've ever seen the town this split. Some folks are calling you a hero, saying you saved lives, and then there's the other side, angry about the mess you caused. It's hard to say which way this is gonna go." David's heart sank as he absorbed her words. He hadn't thought about the impact it would have on the community, on the people who had to deal with the fallout. To him, it had been a simple act of survival. They had stopped the flow of traffic to save lives, to ensure that no more wrecks would happen. But to others, it was an act of defiance, of arrogance, of putting their own judgment above the needs of the larger community. "Do you think we did the right thing?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The waitress paused, as if considering her words carefully. "I don't know. It's hard to say. Maybe in the heat of the moment, it was the right call. But now we're all left to deal with the consequences." David nodded, understanding the weight of her response. It wasn't just about what had happened that day, it was about what would happen next. The tension in the air was thick, and no matter how hard he tried to avoid it, it was clear that the town was changing. He wasn't sure if that change was for the better or for the worse, but one thing was certain, he couldn't go back. The decision had been made, and now they would have to face whatever came next. As he sat in the diner, nursing his coffee and listening to the murmur of the conversations around him, David couldn't help but think back to the moment when they had all made the choice to block the highway. It had been instinctual. There had been no time to think, no time to plan. They had acted in the heat of the moment, driven by a deep sense of responsibility to protect the lives of those on the road. But now, as the dust began to settle, the weight of their actions was becoming harder to ignore. David knew that he couldn't change what had happened. He couldn't undo the disruption, the anger, the division that had been caused. But maybe, just maybe, he could help the town heal. If they could all come together, put aside their differences, and see the bigger picture, perhaps they could turn this into something positive. It wasn't about the trucks, or the highway, or the chaos, it was about the lives that had been saved, the lives that had been spared because of their quick thinking and courage. But was that enough to convince the community? Could he convince them that what had happened was for the greater good, or would they always remember the chaos, the traffic jams, the frustration that had followed? David wasn't sure, but as he finished his coffee and stood to leave, he knew that the answers wouldn't come easy. They would take time, and they would take effort. And whether or not the town would ever fully understand what they had done, David was determined to make it right. As he left the diner, he could feel the eyes of the town on him once again. The whispers had already begun, the story spreading like wildfire. But David wasn't running from it. He couldn't. He had made a choice, and now he would live with the consequences, whatever they may be. David's thoughts were scattered as he drove away from the diner, the weight of the town's judgment hanging over him. The road ahead was long and winding, much like the journey that lay before him. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, even though they weren't physically watching. Their voices echoed in his mind, some praising him, others condemning him. But David wasn't concerned with the praise or the condemnation, he was focused on the aftermath of what had transpired. He had made a decision that day, and now he had to live with the consequences. He wasn't sure if they had done the right thing, but what was certain was that they had saved lives. As he drove through the winding streets, he couldn't help but replay the events of the previous day in his mind. It had all happened so quickly. They had been faced with a situation no one had expected, trucks piling up on the highway, a major accident waiting to happen. And in that moment of chaos, David and his fellow truck drivers had acted. They had blocked off the highway, forming a safety net to prevent further crashes, to protect the drivers who were on the road. It had been a calculated risk, but it had paid off. Lives had been saved. But now, the town was divided. Some saw them as heroes, others saw them as troublemakers. David couldn't figure out which side was right. Or if there was even a right side at all. He turned down the familiar road that led to his house. The small, weathered cottage stood in the distance, surrounded by a picket fence and a patch of overgrown grass. It was nothing fancy, just a simple home where David had lived for most of his life. His wife, Sarah, was probably inside, waiting for him. She had always been the steady one, the calm presence in his life. She had kept him grounded through the years, offering him support when the road ahead seemed too uncertain. But now, David wondered how she would react to the news. How would she feel about what he had done? How would the rest of their lives change now that the story had gone public? David parked his truck in the driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the house. He could see Sarah through the window, moving around inside, probably preparing dinner. Her presence brought him a sense of comfort, but it also brought an ache to his chest. He hadn't shared the full details of what had happened with her yet. He hadn't wanted to burden her with it, but now, it felt impossible to keep it from her any longer. He had to tell her the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. He opened the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of cooked food filled the air, and the soft glow of the evening sun filtered through the curtains. Sarah looked up from the stove and smiled, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Hey, love," she said, her voice soft and warm. "How was your day?" David hesitated for a moment before responding. How could he explain everything to her? How could he put into words the chaos and the confusion, the praise and the condemnation, all the conflicting emotions swirling inside him? But there was no going back now. He took a deep breath and sat down at the kitchen table. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of the words. "Yesterday, something happened on the highway, something I wasn't expecting." Sarah's expression shifted from casual curiosity to concern. She walked over to him, wiping her hands on her apron as she sat across from him. "What happened? You look different." David swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can explain it all, but we blocked off the highway. Me and a few other truck drivers. We saw an accident happening, and we didn't think anyone would get there in time. So, we did what we had to do to stop it. We formed a safety net, blocked the road, and stopped the crash from getting worse. We saved lives." Sarah sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing his words. David could see the shock in her eyes, the confusion, but also a hint of understanding. She had always known that he had a strong sense of responsibility, that he would do anything to help others, but this was something different. She had never imagined that David would be at the center of such an intense situation, something so life-altering, something that could change the course of their lives forever. "You blocked off the highway?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did the authorities say?" David shook his head. "That's the thing. Some people are saying we did the right thing, but others are angry. The whole town is talking about it. Some see us as heroes, others see us as troublemakers. I don't know how this is going to end, Sarah. I'm not sure what's next for us." Sarah's face softened as she reached out to take his hand. "David, you're a good man. I know you didn't do this for attention or to cause problems. You did what you thought was right in that moment. You saved lives, and that's something we should be proud of." David nodded, but the words didn't feel like enough. But now everything's changed. The town's divided, and the consequences are starting to hit. The news is everywhere. People are angry, and I don't know how to fix it. Sarah squeezed his hand, her grip strong and reassuring. "We'll figure it out together. You did what you thought was best, and that's all we can ask for. Don't let anyone make you feel like what you did was wrong." David felt a sense of relief wash over him as Sarah's words sank in. He had always relied on her steady support, and now, more than ever, he needed her strength. He couldn't undo what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make the situation better. Together, they could face the challenges that lay ahead. That night, as they sat down to dinner, the atmosphere in the house felt heavier than usual. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a realization that their lives were no longer as simple as they once were. The town was changing, and they were changing with it. But for the first time in a long time, David felt a sense of hope. He didn't know how things would turn out, but he knew that he wasn't alone. Sarah was by his side, and together, they could face whatever came next. The phone rang just as they were finishing dinner. David picked it up, his heart pounding as he saw the name on the caller ID. It was Mike, the trucker who had been with him on the highway. David had been dreading this call, knowing that it meant the story was only going to get bigger. "David, we need to talk," Mike's voice crackled over the line. "This thing is blowing up. The media is calling us, people are asking for interviews, and I don't know what to say." David sighed. "I know. It's everywhere. The town's divided, and I don't know how to fix it. We can't just ignore this, man," Mike said. "We've got to figure out how to handle it. The way things are going, we might be facing some serious fallout." David leaned back in his chair, staring at the phone in his hand. The weight of the situation was heavier than ever. He had acted in the heat of the moment, driven by a deep sense of duty to protect those on the road. But now, as the world watched, the consequences of that decision were starting to feel real. The media was relentless, and the town was divided. They were no longer just truck drivers, they were symbols of something much bigger. And David didn't know if they were ready for it. "Let's meet tomorrow," David said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We'll figure this out. Together." The next morning, David woke up early. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a pale glow over the quiet town. The stillness of the world outside his window felt at odds with the chaos in his mind. Yesterday had been a whirlwind of emotions, decisions, and consequences. Now, it felt like the calm before the storm. He had no idea what to expect today, no idea how the story would unfold, how the town would react, or what the future would hold. But one thing was certain, he couldn't let the weight of the situation crush him. He slowly got dressed and went downstairs, where Sarah was already in the kitchen, brewing coffee. She smiled when she saw him enter, but there was a trace of concern in her eyes. She had been supportive, but the uncertainty of the situation was beginning to wear on them both. "Morning," David said, his voice groggy but steady. He took a seat at the kitchen table, his eyes drawn to the coffee that Sarah had already poured for him. "Morning," Sarah replied softly, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "You okay?" David hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window. "I don't know. I can't shake the feeling that everything's changing. The calls, the interviews, the news. It's all too much, Sarah." She sat down next to him, her hand gently resting on his. "You did what you thought was right. You saved lives. I know it's a lot, but you can't let the noise get to you." David nodded, appreciating her reassurance, but deep down, he knew the situation was far from over. It wasn't just about saving lives anymore, it was about dealing with the fallout, the consequences of their actions, and the way the world was looking at them. "I've got to meet Mike this morning," David said, finally breaking the silence. "We need to figure out how to handle all this. The town's split, the media's on us, and it's only going to get worse if we don't take control of the narrative." Sarah's expression softened, but she didn't try to stop him. She knew that David needed to do this. She trusted him to find the right path, even if it seemed uncertain. "Just be careful, okay?" she said, squeezing his hand gently. "And remember, we'll get through this together." David smiled at her, though it didn't reach his eyes. He could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him, but he knew she was right. They would get through this. He wasn't alone. After breakfast, David grabbed his keys and headed out to the truck. The engine roared to life as he pulled out of the driveway, the familiar hum of the road offering a sense of comfort amid the chaos. He drove through the quiet town, the streets that once felt so familiar now feeling like a foreign landscape. The news of the highway blockade had spread like wildfire. People were talking, debating, and judging. Some hailed David and the other truck drivers as heroes, others criticized them for taking matters into their own hands. And then there were the whispers of those who believed the whole thing was an overreaction, that the situation didn't warrant such drastic measures. As he made his way to the meeting spot, David couldn't help but feel the weight of every decision. He had acted with what he believed was the best interest of others in mind, but now he was facing a community that didn't all see it the same way. He arrived at the diner where he had agreed to meet Mike. The parking lot was almost empty except for a few trucks, and the soft light of the morning was just beginning to brighten the sky. As he stepped out of the truck and walked toward the diner, he saw Mike standing by the door, waiting for him. "Hey," Mike greeted him with a quick nod. "Glad you made it." David returned the nod, his mind still spinning from the night before. "How are you holding up? It's been a crazy 24 hours. Mike exhaled sharply, his face lined with stress. "You could say that. The phone's been ringing off the hook, reporters showing up at my door, the whole town talking about it. Some people are calling us heroes, others, not so much." David could feel the tension in the air. They both knew that what they had done was controversial, but it was hard to argue with the fact that they had saved lives. "We need to figure out what to do," David said. "The longer we let this drag on, the worse it'll get. We need to take control of the narrative, get ahead of this before it spirals out of control." Mike scratched his head, looking thoughtful. Yeah, I've been thinking about that. I've had a few media outlets reaching out, offering interviews. But I'm not sure if that's the best move. The more we talk, the more people seem to twist what we did. David agreed. He had already seen how the media could distort the truth, focusing on sensationalism rather than the real story. I'm not sure interviews are the answer either, David said. But maybe we can get the town to see things from our perspective. If we don't do something, the story's going to get out of hand. They sat down in the booth at the diner, the waitress pouring them coffee. For a few minutes, they just sat in silence, drinking their coffee and thinking about their next move. David could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the other truck drivers, the people they had helped, and the community they called home. Finally, Mike spoke up. What if we held a town meeting? We could get everyone together, explain why we did what we did, and answer questions. Maybe if people hear it from us, they'll understand. David nodded slowly. It was a risky move. A town meeting could either bring people together or tear them further apart. But it was better than letting the story fester in the hands of the media. I think that's our best shot, David said. But we need to make sure we're all on the same page. I'm going to talk to the others. If we're going to do this, we need to be united. After finishing their coffee, David and Mike made their way to the other truckers who had been part of the blockade. They met at a local diner later that afternoon, gathering around a table to discuss their next steps. The group was diverse. Some had been driving trucks for decades, others were newer to the job, but they all shared the same bond, a sense of duty to protect others on the road. They all knew the risk they had taken, but they also knew the lives they had saved. David laid out the plan for the town meeting, explaining that they needed to speak directly to the community and clear up any misconceptions. He could see the hesitation in some of their faces. It wasn't easy to put yourself out there like this, to stand up and defend your actions when you weren't sure how people would respond. But David was determined. We can't keep hiding, David said. We did the right thing, and we need to stand by it. If we let the town turn on us, we lose everything we've worked for. One by one, the other truckers nodded in agreement. They knew this was the right thing to do, even if it was the hardest. The town meeting was scheduled for the following evening. As the time grew nearer, the tension in the air became palpable. Word had spread, and the community gathered in the town hall, eager to hear what the truck drivers had to say. The room was packed with people, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and confusion. When David and the others entered the room, all eyes turned to them. The murmurs stopped, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. David felt the weight of the moment settle over him as he stepped to the front of the room. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. We didn't do this for attention or glory. We did it because we believed it was the right thing to do. We saw a situation that could have ended in tragedy, and we acted to prevent it. David went on to explain the events of that day, the reasoning behind their decision, and the lives they had saved. He acknowledged the risks they had taken, but also the urgency of the situation. As he spoke, the tension in the room began to shift. Some people remained skeptical, but others began to nod, understanding the reasoning behind the truckers' actions. When the meeting was over, the community was still divided, but something had changed. People were talking, asking questions, and reflecting on the event. David and the others had made their case, and now it was up to the town to decide how to move forward. As David walked out of the town hall that night, he felt a sense of relief. The weight of the unknown had lessened, but the journey was far from over. He had no idea how the story would end, but he knew one thing for certain: he had done what he believed was right, and that was enough. The road ahead was still uncertain, but David was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he wasn't alone. The community may have been divided, but together, they would find a way to heal and move forward. And that was the most important thing of all.